Only one man in American history has served as the mayor of a city, a congressman, a senator, the governor of a state, the vice president, and the president of the United States. And I think it's fair to say that if any president lived the American dream, it was him. You see, he was born to a poor family. He had virtually no formal education. He came from truly humble beginnings, and nothing in his background would suggest that one day he would become the president of the United States, and yet he did. So this is a real rags to riches story. Heck, this guy was even born in a log cabin, which gave him that rugged frontiersman reputation, something that Americans loved in their presidents back then. Not only that, but this man was known as a man of the people. He came from them, he identified with them, and he consistently looked out for them. They saw him as a man of courage and conviction, and they elected him to office over and over for decades. And if that wasn't enough, he was a family man. He fell in love and got married at the age of 18, and remained married to his wife for almost 50 years. So here's a guy with the quintessential American story. If you could write the life story of a president, especially one in the 19th century, it would probably look something like this. And it might even make a pretty good movie, like a combination of a Horatio Alger story mixed with a little bit of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And the funny thing is that Hollywood actually did make a movie about him. In the 1940s, a movie came out about this president, since the story was just too good to pass up. Now, with all of that said, you might be surprised to learn that this same man is universally considered one of the worst presidents in American history. And that probably doesn't even begin to describe just how vilified he is. He's actually considered one of the most detestable Americans, let alone presidents of all time. How can all of this be possible? Well, it is possible, and that's what we're going to try to figure out as we examine the story of Andrew Johnson, our 17th president. So some of you might be wondering just why I'm doing an episode on Andrew Johnson or on any bad or forgotten president. Well, presidents have always fascinated me. Almost all of them do, including the so-called good ones as well as the so-called bad ones. I sometimes wondered whether it was fair to put these labels on them anyways, because the truth is always a bit more complicated. Now, Elie Wiesel once said that, quote, "The opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference." And I think this quote fairly describes the status of a lot of our presidents. Most Americans are simply indifferent about most of our presidents, like Millard Fillmore and Chester Arthur. We love learning about the big ones, the Washingtons and the Lincolns, but we tend to see the minor ones as just brief interludes, as transitional figures. Maybe there's some truth to that view, but that wasn't the case at the time. During their time in office, that president was the president of the United States. They were the highest-ranking person in the land. We label our presidents as either good or bad because it makes things easier for us. But in doing so, I wonder, do we lose something when we do this? When we are indifferent to someone like Andrew Johnson, do we lose a piece of the American story? Do we miss an important lesson from history? Is it possible that even a bad or obscure president has an interesting story to tell and could tell us something important about our country and maybe even about us today? Well, I believe that Andrew Johnson's story does have something important to tell us, and that we as Americans ignore it to our detriment. So Andrew Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1808 to a poor family. His father cleaned horse stables and his mother washed clothes for a living. Unfortunately, his father died when Andrew was 3, leaving his mother as the breadwinner of the family. When Andrew was 10, he was apprenticed as a tailor because being apprenticed is what happened to a lot of poor kids at that time. But when he became a teenager, Andrew got tired of his mentor and he ran away with his older brother. So here we see Andrew demonstrating, even as a teenager, some of the qualities that he would show later in public life. He was someone who wasn't afraid to make a big decision in the midst of uncertainty. A reward was posted for his return, which made him fearful of capture, so he fled out west, mostly on foot to Tennessee. And he eventually settled in the city of Greenville. So there, Andrew began his own tailoring business and begun to prosper. And when he turned 18, he married a woman named Eliza McCardle, the daughter of a shoemaker. Now, Andrew received no formal schooling, but throughout his career as a tailor, he learned to read from people he worked with and from customers. And his wife Eliza would help him too, since she had some education. By the way, sometimes that shows up as a trivia question, so if they ever ask you which president was taught by his wife how to read, you now know it's Andrew Johnson. Now, as Andrew improved his reading and writing proficiency, he realized he loved reading, and specifically, he loved reading about politics, about the great political issues of the day. And he would engage his customers in political debates. He started to realize that he had a passion and a real knack for politics. So this is probably a good time to pause for a moment and take a look at the broader context. Around this time, the country was about to enter what we now call the era of Jacksonian democracy. And this was a time when a new generation of leadership took power and led the nation in a new direction. The founding fathers had passed from the scene, and Andrew Jackson, the famous general from the War of 1812, was elected president in 1828. Now, Jackson was a populist, someone who identified with the common man, someone a bit like Andrew Johnson. And it probably didn't hurt that they had similar names. And like Johnson, Andrew Jackson was born in the Carolinas and settled in Tennessee. General Jackson was a hero to Americans who weren't part of the aristocratic elite or the so-called establishment. So it's no surprise that Johnson identified with him and his politics. And in a time when the common man was in, when having humble beginnings was an asset rather than a liability, Andrew Johnson entered politics and found his calling. And I think this is where hindsight can sometimes affect the way we see historical figures. Now, as I said earlier, Andrew Johnson is considered one of our worst presidents, but that can obscure the fact that he experienced a great deal of political success in his life. Now, in his early 20s, he was elected as an alderman to Greenville, which basically meant he was a city councilman. And then at the age of 25, the city council elected him the mayor of a city. Not bad for a 25-year-old or someone who didn't have a formal education. And 1 year later, he ran for the Tennessee House of Representatives. And during the debate, he apparently outperformed the other candidates and won by a landslide, a 2-to-1 margin. Eventually, he would have a 30-year streak of winning elections. And 2 years later, he was elected as a Tennessee state senator. So there was a time when Andrew Johnson was a rising star in Tennessee politics. And he's doing pretty well in other areas of his life, too. He dabbled in some real estate, and his tailoring business was prospering, which he then sold off to focus more on politics. And it's interesting to me that many of our presidents, specifically our so-called bad presidents, actually enjoyed great successes in their life, and it makes you wonder just how much success is a predictor for presidential greatness. Now, when Johnson was in his mid-20s, he purchased his first slave, a teenage girl named Dolly. And by the time he was a Tennessee state senator, he had 9 slaves. And as we know, this was a time when slavery was a reality of life in the South. Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin in 1793, and that dramatically increased the demand for slave labor and expanded slavery throughout the South. So Johnson is now a slaveholder, like many of his fellow Southerners, and more on that later. Now, Johnson's political rise took him from Tennessee to the national capital. In 1842, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and cultivated a reputation as a Jacksonian populist, someone who fought for the interests of the poor, for limited government, and for lowering tariffs. He also fell in line with the Southern stance against the abolition of slavery. He believed that slaves were property and that their masters had a right to own them without federal or state interference. Obviously, this issue would become more important in the future. So Johnson continued to rise. He was elected governor of Tennessee, where he served 2 two-year terms, and then he was elected as a U.S. senator. Now, Johnson at this time seemed to have a reputation as one of those guys you either loved or hated. You get the sense that he had a reputation for being a bit abrasive, that he could rub people the wrong way. Now, the opposing party, the Whigs, hated him. One Whig newspaper referred to him as, quote, the vilest radical and most unscrupulous demagogue in the Union. So that's quite an appraisal. But he was even disliked among the elite of his own party, the Democrats, and even the planter class, those who owned large plantations in the South. Now, James Polk, our 11th president, had a lot in common with Johnson. Both were Jacksonian Democrats from Tennessee. They seemed like they would be natural allies. But listen to what Polk had to say about the young Andrew Johnson. Quote, "He has been politically, if not personally, hostile to me during my whole term. He's very vindictive and perverse in his temper and conduct. If he had the manliness and independence to declare his opposition openly, he knows he could not be elected by his constituents. I am not aware I have ever given him cause for offense." So you have the image of a guy that rubs people the wrong way, someone seen as rude or embittered, not liked by many people, including those in his own party. But those who hated Johnson couldn't stop his support among the rural and poor populations of his state, the people who essentially formed his base. He continued to ride that populist wave throughout his career. What seemed rude to his peers looked like refreshing honesty to his constituents. What seemed stubborn to his detractors appeared as principle to his supporters. He was basically an anti-establishment or insurgent political figure whose rise came at the expense of the elites of both parties. So in a sense, Johnson is a historical ancestor of the anti-establishment populist figures you might see today. So the 1860 election is approaching, and Johnson has ambitions for the presidency. By now he's 51 years old. But 1860 is not an ordinary year. The country is divided like it's never been before, and the South is threatening to leave the Union. To this day, people are divided about exactly what that division was about. Slavery, states' rights, tariffs, maybe all of the above. Now, Johnson took his stand when it came to slavery. He railed against the abolitionists and argued that African Americans were not entitled to the same rights as white Americans. Though he was interested in the presidency, he did not get the nomination. The Democrats were divided that year. Its northern and southern wings broke off and nominated their own candidates, and that virtually handed the election to a new party, the Republican Party, and their candidate, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Johnson personally knew Lincoln since they served together in Congress. And as anyone who has read anything about the Civil War knows, Lincoln's opposition to the expansion of slavery was unacceptable to the southern states, and months after the election, they began to secede or leave the Union. Now, it is during this time that Andrew Johnson makes a decision that will change his life and the course of American history. In a combination of stubbornness, you could maybe even say courage or even principle, Johnson comes out in support of the Union. He was the only Southern senator from a Confederate state to support the Union. So when the Confederacy is formed, Johnson says he will have no part in it and went home to Tennessee to try to convince the state to remain in the Union. In doing so, he encountered a great deal of verbal and physical attacks on his own life. It got so bad he carried a gun with him whenever he spoke in public. Now again, here is where hindsight can be tricky. Sometimes we have to fight the temptation of bias, especially when it comes to a vilified historical figure. Regardless of how you feel about Andrew Johnson, about his views on slavery, about his judgment, or his subsequent performance as president, you have to admit that it must have taken an enormous amount of determination to do what he did, to stand against his Southern colleagues and remain with the Union. In doing so, Johnson rendered himself persona non grata among his colleagues and his constituents. Now, I'm not going to venture into the motivations that Johnson had. Some historians say that he was sincere in his love for the Union. Others say that he knew he would have a minimal amount of power in the Confederacy because he, surprised, didn't get along with his Southern colleagues. So maybe he was just doing it for his own political ambitions. But either way, he clearly was not afraid to go his own way in a time of great division and controversy, and even physical danger to himself. And we should also note that he did reap political rewards for his stance among Northerners, but still, this was a dangerous time, and he wasn't afraid to take a dangerous position. So when the Civil War broke out in 1861, Johnson was a prominent, maybe the most prominent pro-Union Southerner. So you can imagine that he was of considerable value to the Northern government and to his old colleague, President Abraham Lincoln. When the North reconquered parts of Tennessee, Lincoln appointed Johnson its military governor in March 1862. In response to their old friend, the South retaliated by taking over Johnson's property and converting it into a military hospital. Now, while the Civil War rages, the 1864 election is coming up. Lincoln's vice president is a man named Hannibal Hamlin, who, in my opinion, is probably one of the best named vice presidents in history. Can I just say that I love that we once had a vice president named Hannibal? And it's the closest we've ever been to having a president named Hannibal. He joins the list of vice presidents with names that no one gives their kids anymore, along with Rufus King and Hubert Humphrey, so we should bring it back. Anyways, with his re-election campaign approaching, President Lincoln is intrigued by the prospect of adding a Southern Democrat to the ticket. So remember, Lincoln was a Midwestern Republican, and adding a Southern Democrat to the ticket would allow them to truly be called a Union ticket. And that's what the Republicans call themselves that year, the National Union Party. It's a novel idea, and one that looks good on paper. And since Johnson is the most prominent Southern Unionist, he ends up on the ticket. So think about it. Andrew Johnson, a Democrat who is respected in the North and vilified in the South, who bet on the side of the Union, is now the Republican Party's nominee for Vice President of the United States. And this is something we probably won't see for a very long time, or ever. One party nominating someone from the other party on its ticket. So it looks like Johnson's decision to leave the Confederacy was paying off, assuming, of course, that he and Lincoln won the election and the North won the war. So that fall, the Lincoln-Johnson ticket wins, and Johnson is now vice president-elect. With Grant and Sherman's victories, the Union is approaching victory in a hard-fought war where over 600,000 men died during a 4-year period. Now, Johnson is headed to his inauguration as vice president, which will be on March 4th, 1865. That was the day he and Lincoln were to be inaugurated. And here we will see an episode that would haunt Johnson for the rest of his life. The trouble all started when Johnson was traveling to Washington for Inauguration Day. Apparently he caught a bug and was a bit under the weather during the trip. The night before his swearing in, Johnson had a little too much to drink at a party in his honor. So he was a bit hungover the next day, the day of the actual inauguration. He finds himself a bit sick and a little tipsy on the biggest day of his life. He asks his soon-to-be predecessor, yes, our old friend Hannibal Hamlin, for some whiskey because, the only thing to cure a hangover is more alcohol. And then apparently that's what some people believed back then. Lo and behold, after drinking more alcohol, he becomes more drunk. So back then, vice presidents gave inaugural addresses too, but in front of Congress. So Johnson is giving his speech as the new vice president in front of President Lincoln, outgoing Vice President Hamlin, and the Congress. And apparently, Johnson was flat out drunk, and it showed. Everyone knew it. So now we have what had to have been one of the most awkward moments in American history. Andrew Johnson is up on the platform in front of the most powerful leaders in the country during a time of war when soldiers are dying out in the field, and there he is babbling incoherently. But even worse than that, Andrew Johnson is a belligerent drunk. Not a happy drunk, but a belligerent drunk. And the alcohol brings out the worst in him. He has a big chip on his shoulder since he came from poverty. He resented anyone who came from privilege, so he starts scolding the audience and rubbing in his humble beginnings. He yells out to them, "You got your power from the people whose creatures you are." He calls out the cabinet by name one at a time. And he even pulled one of those stage whispers. He forgot the name of the Secretary of Navy and very audibly asked someone next to him, "Hey, what's that guy's name?" It's like one of those scenes you see in a sitcom or a movie. And you have to remember, this was a time when people were really serious about the dignity of public office, so much so that the act of campaigning itself was seen as something improper. One newspaper later wrote, quote, "The senators on the Republican side began to hide their faces." You can imagine this was a painful moment to endure. Just picture everyone there doing one big collective facepalm. You have to think there must have been some regret about throwing this man on their party's ticket. And I wish I could have seen outgoing Vice President Hamlin's face. He had to have been thinking, they replaced me for him for that? Needless to say, no one was pleased, least of all his boss, President Lincoln. Johnson then had the ceremonial duty of swearing in new senators, but was in no state to do so. Just moments later, Lincoln went on to get sworn in for a second term and to deliver his second inaugural address. And it was just Johnson's luck that Lincoln would go on to deliver what is considered one of the greatest and most profound presidential speeches in American history. That speech is chiseled on the walls of his memorial. So basically, history records on that day that Johnson acted like a complete buffoon in public while Lincoln was a complete statesman. And you can get a glimpse of this episode. There's actually a famous photo of Lincoln giving his second inaugural address. You should look it up sometime. There are a few interesting stories associated with this picture. One is that John Wilkes Booth, the man who would assassinate Lincoln about a month later, is in the photo with his conspirators. And the other is that Andrew Johnson can be seen seated close to Lincoln, covering his face with his hat. Now, I remember reading somewhere that he did this because he was trying to hide how red his face was from the alcohol or maybe the embarrassment or maybe both. I'm not sure if this is a true story, but it does make a good story. Now, it's really unfortunate that this happened because, as one can imagine, Andrew Johnson got a reputation as a drunk, and perhaps it was deserved. I mean, come on, Andrew, you had one job. Just don't embarrass the president, especially on that one day. But at the same time, Johnson wasn't a drunk. Yeah, he was drunk that one time, but he wasn't an alcoholic. He just decided to let loose the night before what was, up until that moment, the most important day of his life. Shortly thereafter, President Lincoln vouched for Johnson, saying, quote, "I've known Andy Johnson for many years. He made a bad slip the other day, but you need not be scared. Andy ain't a drunkard." So anyways, back to the Civil War. A little over a month later, on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant, and the Civil War is, in effect, over. And now the Lincoln administration turned to the difficult problem of reunifying the nation after its bloodiest war. But in a very short period of time, one of the most infamous acts in history will change the fate of the nation and Andrew Johnson. Before I go on to that, here's a quick aside. Have you ever heard of Daniel Tompkins, Richard Johnson, or John Breckinridge? Well, these three men were 19th century vice presidents. Almost no one today knows anything about them. No one knows who they were. In the annals of American history, they are mere footnotes, people on some list, and nothing more, at least in the minds of most Americans. Well, Andrew Johnson very well could have been one of those people, but for the actions of a man named John Wilkes Booth. On April 14, 1865, in Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth took aim at President Lincoln's head and pulled the trigger. In doing so, Booth changed the course of American history and Andrew Johnson's life. Actually, Johnson was almost a victim. You see, the night Lincoln was shot, Booth and his men were carrying out a conspiracy to decapitate the federal government by killing its highest-ranking leaders in the executive branch. You probably know that there are countless conspiracy theories related to the Kennedy assassination, most of which are speculation. Well, when it comes to the Lincoln assassination, there is no speculation. There is no doubt that it was conspiracy. And it got terrifyingly close to succeeding. Obviously, it succeeded in killing President Lincoln. But it almost led to the death of Secretary of State William Seward, who was stabbed multiple times in his home by one of Booth's conspirators. Fortunately, Seward survived. And another conspirator, a man named George Atzerodt, got into close proximity to Vice President Johnson. He was supposed to kill Johnson, but Atzerodt got cold feet and ended up getting drunk that night instead. At any rate, historians can only speculate how close America came to losing its top three executive branch officers at that very end of the Civil War and the chaos that would have ensued. So the next morning, April 15th at 7:22 a.m., Abraham Lincoln breathed his last, and Andrew Johnson, the poor boy from Tennessee, the tailor with no formal education, became the 17th president of the United States. He was the first president to enter office upon the assassination of his predecessor, and he was taking office in a time of critical importance. The nation had never experienced a presidential assassination before. Coming in the wake of the Civil War, Andrew Johnson was walking on untrodden ground. Most Americans knew nothing about their nation's new leader. Some saw him as an illegitimate or accidental president. Later, he would be labeled as, quote, the elect of an assassin. And remember, this was the guy who publicly embarrassed himself on Inauguration Day just 5 weeks earlier. The guy who some loved, but many even in his own party hated. And yet this was the man on whom the fate of post-Civil War America would rest. Upon taking office, President Johnson faced two major issues, both of which were interconnected. The first was the fate of 4 million newly freed former slaves. What rights would they be entitled to? How would they be integrated into society? The second issue was what to do with the former rebel states. These issues would frame the national discourse for the era we now called Reconstruction, when the country was deciding how to reconstruct itself in the wake of the Civil War. Now, during the war, President Lincoln had advocated what was considered a lenient policy towards the South. According to the plan, 10% of the number of voters from the 1860 election in a given southern state would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the Union and accept emancipation. Pardons would be issued to all Southerners except for the major political and military Confederate leaders. Once that was done, the state could rejoin the Union. Lincoln drafted this plan during the Civil War with the hope that it would induce the South to seek peace. So some of you might think, well, that makes sense. The Civil War was waged primarily for restoring the Union, so it makes sense to forge a peace with a spirit of reconciliation. And on top of that, recent history seems to teach us that vengeful treaties can sow the seeds for future wars, like the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. Now, there may be some truth to that, but the situation was a bit more complicated than that. Remember those 4 million newly freed former slaves? Well, Lincoln didn't have a chance to address that, even though he had fought to abolish slavery with the 13th Amendment. And Lincoln's lenient plans sparked opposition from a group called the Radical Republicans. And this group couldn't quite get over the enormous costs of the Southern Rebellion, and they felt that the plan was basically letting the South off easy. Instead, the Radicals wanted to take advantage of the situation and break the Southern aristocracy. Now, there were many reasons for this. It probably depended on who you were talking to. It's always hard to discern intentions, especially when everyone alive at the time is dead now. But we can surmise that some wanted to do it out of what they felt was justice. Some wanted revenge on the South. Some had political reasons, i.e. so that the Republicans could dominate the broken Democrats in future elections. And some supported this because they knew that if the Southern aristocracy wasn't broken up, it would try to maintain the social status quo, and that meant that power would continue to reside mainly in the hands of white planters, and that the newly freed African Americans would essentially be screwed. They would be vulnerable to exploitation and indentured servitude, basically slavery in all but name. So with these concerns, the Radicals countered Lincoln with a Reconstruction plan of their own, which, among other things, stipulated that a majority of voters, rather than the 10% Lincoln wanted, had to swear the loyalty oath. So you had the Radical Republicans who took a hard line against the South and were in favor of protecting African American rights. But you also had moderate Republicans that generally favored leniency towards the South and supported Lincoln's plan. It was basically a compromise position. And then you had Democrats, mainly the Southern Party, who wanted a quick restoration of the Southern states to the Union. And those two latter groups, the moderate Republicans and the Democrats, in descending order, were generally more lukewarm or outright hostile to the idea of enfranchising African Americans. Now, this is all a simplification to an extent, but you get the picture. The problem was that there seemed to be a trade-off. On one hand, you had the option of a lenient peace that would restore the Union relatively smoothly, but one that would likely preserve the social status quo and endanger the rights of African Americans. On the other hand, you could come down with a hammer on the South and break up the Southern planter class, which would likely require a military occupation of the South, but with the hope to enforce the rights of African Americans. And if you wanted the best combination of both, reconciliation of the Union while protecting African Americans, you probably needed some level of extraordinary political genius to bring together two sides that up until then were irreconcilable. Heck, they had just gone to war over these things. And this was the immensely difficult decision history gave to Andrew Johnson. Now, to some people, this may be an easy choice, but remember, at the time, you have to consider what people had experienced and were thinking. They had just gone through a civil war where 600,000 people had died. Many of them just wanted to restore the Union and move on. So back to Andrew Johnson. Now, before I get into what he did, let's recap a little bit about him. We do know one thing about him for sure. He was stubborn, that he was not afraid to go his own way. But he was also another thing that's important to point out. When it came to politics, Andrew Johnson identified with what is called the strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. And what that means is that Johnson had a very strict view about what the Constitution said. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but what I take this to mean is that he believed that the federal government was limited in its powers while all other rights were reserved to the states and the people. The Constitution listed out limited powers for the federal government, and if a hypothetical power was not listed in the document, it didn't exist. He was not willing to go much further than what the Constitution expressly stated. Now, this type of thinking might or might not be in vogue in some circles, but there are many people who sincerely believed in this political philosophy then and still do now. And this philosophy isn't necessarily the same thing as originalism, but I won't delve more into a subject I'm not an expert in, except to say that I think it's crucial to understanding why Andrew Johnson did what he did. Now, when Johnson became president in April 1865, Congress was out of session and was not scheduled to reconvene until December of that year. So that's from April to December of 1865. So that basically left Johnson completely in charge of formulating Reconstruction policy for the rest of that year. So during that time, Johnson unilaterally implemented his plan. And it basically adhered to Lincoln's plan, if not in fact, at least in spirit. Remember those three options I listed out earlier? Well, Johnson chose the option that sought restoration of the Union. But he also ignored African American rights, at least from the federal government's perspective. He basically fast-tracked the southern states' restoration to the Union, and in doing so, maintained the social fabric of the South. The planter class would remain dominant in the South. Now, the southern population would be required to take loyalty oaths, draft new constitution, abolish slavery, and renounce secession, but Johnson issued pardons en masse to the vast majority of former Confederates, and that allowed them to remain in power. And the South complied quickly so as to restore their representative power in the federal government, in the Congress. Now, as expected, this led to fears about the status of African Americans in the South, that they would be left unprotected. When these concerns were raised and pressure was applied for the federal government to take action to protect them, Johnson demurred. And his reason was that it wasn't the role of the federal government to intervene to help the African Americans. In fact, he indicated at times that he lamented the actions of the Southerners, but he continued to refuse to use the federal government to act. And this was in line with Johnson's strict constructionist principles. Now, this is all very interesting because it was known that Johnson bitterly resented the planter class. Remember, he doesn't like rich people, Southerners included. So if he detested them so much, why would he basically help them out? Why would he enable them to maintain their status? Some turn to his strict constructionist views. Others say he genuinely wanted to follow Lincoln's policy of reconciliation. Historians have tried to discern Johnson's motives, and again, I think this is dangerous territory for any historian. It could have been a combination of these factors. But this is where it's important to talk about Andrew Johnson's views on race. Now, there is an interesting story about Johnson that comes from Frederick Douglass, the great African-American abolitionist, and it occurred on the same day as Lincoln's second inauguration. So yes, this is the same day that Andrew Johnson got drunk in public. Douglass had attended the inauguration that day and saw both Lincoln and Johnson. And I'll just read the story as Douglass wrote it himself. Quote, "There are moments in the lives of most men when the doors of their souls are open, and unconsciously to themselves. Their true characters may be read by the observant eye. It was at such an instant when I caught a glimpse of the real nature of this man," speaking of Andrew Johnson, "which all subsequent developments proved true. I was standing in the crowd by the side of Mrs. Thomas J. Dorsey when Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson and pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that I observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. It was useless to close the door when all within had been seen. His first glance was the frown of the man. The second was the bland and sickly smile of the demagogue. I turned to Mrs. Dorsey and said, 'Whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he is no friend of our race.'" Moments like these and subsequent policy decisions have convinced most historians that Andrew Johnson was a blatant racist. And historians do not divorce these feelings from his decisions as president. They have traced Johnson's policies towards the South, allowing the status quo to persist, refusing to protect African American rights, not only to his support for strict constructionism, but also because of his racial views. And these decisions had consequences because the preservation of the Southern status quo after the Civil War is considered the direct cause of what would become what we now call black codes, what would later develop into Jim Crow, basically the use of various pressures, laws, traditions, etc. that discriminated against African Americans, denying them of their rights, relegating them to second-class citizens, and segregating them off from whites, things that held African Americans back for over a century, alienating both races, and are the sources of tensions that we still see today. Now, race is a complicated issue, and there are lots of uncomfortable things that people in the past have said that can be construed as racist. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, the man that we learned freed the slaves, he himself has a complicated history with race. But Andrew Johnson seems to stand out when it comes to presidents and racism. I mean, James Buchanan is considered an awful president, and he sided with the infamous Dred Scott decision. That was the decision excluding African Americans from citizenship. But he seems to be maligned more for his ineffectiveness and is generally not portrayed as a racist. Johnson, on the other hand, is considered a blatant racist, even by the standards of his time. And it makes me wonder, is this perhaps the worst timing of any president in American history? Now, there's never a good time for a bad president, no less a racist one, but think about it. Americans just fought a war between its own citizens, which resulted in the freeing of 4 million slaves, and now faced a critical crossroads in its own social future in the relationship between the two races among its population. And through historical accident, for reasons almost exclusively based on political considerations, and because of an assassination, one of the most racist American political figures of all time ascends to the presidency. You think back to Lincoln and the Republicans putting Johnson on the ticket in 1864 because of the feel-good story of having a Northern Republican and a Southern Democrat on the ticket. And it just makes me wonder, did any of them know about Johnson's views on race? Did they ever come up? Or is this just something that people didn't think of? I guess enough people shared Johnson's views that it doesn't have the same impact then as it does now. And it makes me wonder about what Abraham Lincoln thought and knew about his vice president. Now, as we saw earlier, Lincoln knew Johnson for years, but the nature of their friendship is lost to history. But it always intrigued me whether Lincoln thought much about what a Johnson presidency would mean, especially if it would profoundly affect Lincoln's own legacy and what he was planning to do after the Civil War. And you have to add that to the fact that there were some indications Lincoln anticipated his own assassination. These are the things that are hard to verify, but apparently Lincoln's wife, some of his friends, and his bodyguard reportedly said that Lincoln had strange dreams of his own assassination, just weeks before he actually was killed. And if that is the case, I wonder if Lincoln considered what kind of president Johnson would be, if he would carry out Lincoln's own plans for Reconstruction and for guaranteeing the rights of African Americans. So by the time Congress reconvenes in April 1865, it is a bit concerned about Johnson's Reconstruction policies for all of the reasons I mentioned above, so they try to modify them. The first thing the Republicans do is refuse to seat the new congressmen elected by the new Southern state governments. Then a couple of months later, in February 1866, Congress passes a critical piece of legislation, an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. And this was a government agency created during the Civil War under Lincoln to provide African Americans with basic necessities like food, water, clothing, and shelter, and provide other services like education because, they didn't have much of this at all, being newly freed former slaves and all. Many Republicans believed Johnson would sign the bill, but on February 18th, Johnson vetoed it, arguing that it was an encroachment on states' rights and it discriminated against white Americans. Now, less than a week later, on February 22nd, 1866, the country is celebrating George Washington's birthday. President Johnson gives a speech that day supposedly to celebrate the father of the nation, but instead, he gives a speech that amounts to a declaration of war against the Republicans, specifically the radical Republicans. The president calls out several of them by name, specifically Senator Charles Sumner and Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, going so far as to claim that they were plotting his assassination. So remember when I referred to Johnson as stubborn or maybe even racist? Well, it was here that people started describing Johnson as unhinged. And you start seeing him doing something he'll continue to do more of, swinging wildly, lashing out, just saying ridiculous things. And now he is at war with the majority party in Congress. So this is the time period I like to refer to as the Congress Strikes Back. It passes a civil rights bill in March 1866, just a month after the speech, to ensure the rights of citizenship for African Americans, despite President Johnson's opposition. And as you can expect, Johnson vetoed it. It was at this point that the moderate Republicans, the ones that were looking for compromise, realized that they couldn't work with Johnson. So this basically unifies the moderate and radical Republicans against Johnson. And they take the unprecedented action of overriding Johnson's veto. You need 2/3 of the Congress to override the president's vetoes, and that's what they have. Now, I say that this was unprecedented because this was the first time that Congress overrode the veto of a major piece of legislation. And it would start a trend for the rest of Johnson's presidency. So now that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 is passed, Congress is concerned that the provisions of that bill might be overturned by a future Congress. Now, you're not going to have that 2/3 majority forever, right? So they decided that they want to write it into the Constitution. So they passed the 14th Amendment in June of 1866. And that's exactly what it does. It basically turns the Civil Rights Act into an amendment in the Constitution, making it very hard to ever overturn. And it made acceptance of this amendment as a condition for Southern states to rejoin the Union. Johnson predictably opposed it, but it didn't require a signature for ratification because it went to the states to ratify. In doing so, and rewriting the rules for Reconstruction, this basically threw Johnson's Reconstruction plan in limbo. So all of those states looking to join the Union, the ones that had already rejoined the Union, now the whole thing was in limbo. And things got really ugly. Congress and the president are at war with the future of the African Americans, the Union, the fabric of society at stake. And it was in this atmosphere that the 1866 midterm elections took place. And Johnson basically turns the election as a referendum on himself. So Johnson leaves the White House on a tour of the nation where he campaigns to rally support for his policies against the Republicans. Now, presidents do this all the time nowadays, especially in election years, but you have to think that during this time and up until the first half of the 20th century, it was considered unseemly for a president to campaign at all. I mean, even by the 1920s, our presidential candidates spent campaigns just giving speeches from their front porch at home. They didn't travel around the country. They didn't engage in politicking. The idea was that the office sought the man, not the other way around. So for Johnson to campaign was seen as beneath the dignity of the office of the president. Now, that alone was something that turned off a lot of Americans. But what happened next was worse than they could have even imagined. This big campaign trip, it's become known as the swing around the circle. It's been described as one of the most disastrous political initiatives ever undertaken by a president. So basically, for 3 weeks, from late August to mid-September, President Johnson traveled around the country, which included stops in Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, in Indianapolis, New York, Chicago, and St. Louis, all the big cities in the United States. Now, things seemed to be going pretty well initially as he encountered pretty friendly crowds. But once he arrived in the Midwest, things got ugly. Now, Johnson was a seasoned campaigner, and he was not afraid to engage in a fight and was easily provoked. And the Republicans took advantage of this, and they planted hecklers in the crowd. And Johnson just couldn't help himself. He took the bait. And if there was any question about whether Johnson was unhinged, it ended here. In the words of his biographer Hans Trefeu, Johnson publicly compared himself to Jesus Christ several times and explained that, like the Savior himself, that he too liked to pardon unrepentant sinners. He talked about hanging his political opponents, calling them out by name. When he was told that he was sullying his position as president, Johnson retorted, "I don't care about my dignity." Now, the more Johnson became unhinged, the more hostile his crowds got. Things got more and more violent until at one campaign stop, shots were fired and one person was actually killed. Newspapers shocked their Victorian-era readers by reporting that their president was engaging in the equivalent of a verbal street brawl with hecklers. By now, Johnson's own supporters were turning on him. One formerly supportive newspaper wrote, quote, It is mortifying to see a man occupying the lofty position of President of the United States descend from that position and join issue with those who are dragging their garments in the muddy gutters of political vituperation. Needless to say, the trip was a disaster. It pretty much achieved the opposite of what Johnson had intended. Now, Johnson was already written off by his enemies, the Republicans, but now he's an embarrassment to his supporters. One senator estimated that the trip cost Johnson 1 million Northern votes. And all of this was confirmed on election night when the Republicans won big. The Republicans gained 2/3 majorities in both the House and Senate, and that allowed them to override Johnson's vetoes even further. In the Senate, the Republicans won 18 seats, and to this day, it is still the largest single gain by a party in the chamber's history. Now, I think this trip is a summation of so many reasons why historians consider Johnson a terrible president. Now, we know he was stubborn, even foolhardy, and he wasn't afraid to go his own way, and that might be courageous in some situations. But a big reason why historians knock Johnson isn't just for his views on race, but also because he was politically inept at a time when we needed political genius. And again, that's something I've always found fascinating, considering Johnson had so much political experience. After all, he was the only man in American history to be a governor and mayor, congressman, senator, vice president, president, etc. But the more I thought about it, I realized that this resume was really misleading because while Johnson had all that experience, he wasn't one of those politicians that had the right type of experience. He was one of those fringe politicians, the kind that is disliked by a significant number, maybe even a majority of their peers in the country, but has support from a small but devoted group of constituents that ensures that he continues to get elected over and over. So people like this don't know much about gaining consensus and governing. If you've ever wondered what it would be like to have a fringe candidate with a narrow base of support for president, there's probably no better example of that than Andrew Johnson. When it came to being stubborn, there is no one better. But politically, he was stupid. And things like this happen, where you have somebody politically stupid as president, where you have these great plans to go on a big trip to rally public support, and it totally backfires and leads to the completely opposite result. So now that the Republicans have veto-proof majority, they turn specifically to rewriting Johnson's entire Reconstruction program. Remember his program to fast-track the southern states back into the Union? Well, that's over with. In March 1867, at the start of the new Congress, Congress passes the Reconstruction Act, again over Johnson's veto. And what this does is that it militarizes the Reconstruction program. It creates 5 military districts in the South, all under martial law, putting the South under military rule. Military governors were appointed to run the state governments, and each state would be required to ratify the 14th Amendment, and that would guarantee suffrage from African Americans. While 7 southern states were restored to the Union by June of 1868, many Southerners saw the Reconstruction Act as nothing short of a tyrannical military occupation. Now, to Johnson, you have to remember that he believed that he was carrying out Lincoln's policies for a speedy restoration of the Union, and from his point of view, he felt that the Republicans were establishing a tyranny in the South and provoking the same disunion that led to the Civil War in the first place. So Johnson probably saw himself as anything as the man who wanted to bring healing to the country while the radicals in Congress were stirring the pot. Now, this is where we see a full-blown war break out between Congress and the president, not just on policy, that's already been going on, but specifically on the president's constitutional powers, including his authority as commander-in-chief. What results is nothing short of a constitutional crisis, and one with multiple layers, a very complicated and dangerous situation. Remember, this is literally just after the Civil War. So during the 1866 election, Johnson threatened to fire his cabinet since some of its members were radical Republicans. This, among other things, Johnson said, greatly concerned Congress. They wanted these radicals to stay in the cabinet. So in March 1867, they passed the Tenure of Office Act. And this piece of legislation basically required the president to get the Senate's permission to fire certain federal government officials. It was blatantly a political law. Regardless of how you feel about the radical Republicans, this was controversial. It was basically the result of Johnson's desire to fire his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, because Stanton was a radical Republican and supported the Congress's Reconstruction program. Now, if you're thinking that the Tenure of Office Act sounds unconstitutional, well, the Supreme Court agreed because in 1926, the majority wrote in an opinion that the law was invalid. By then, it had already been repealed, but at any rate, it had the force of law in 1867. In response, Johnson decided to stick it to Congress and fire Stanton in August of 1867, in direct defiance of the law. But there's more to this battle. You'll remember that Congress had placed the Southern governments under the authority of the military districts. Well, this in effect put the military force of the South under the control of Congress instead of the president. And Johnson, believing with some justification that this was a violation of his powers as commander-in-chief, sought as a remedy to stop Congress, to obstruct them, and he used various means. That included firing Stanton and firing the military commanders that Congress had put in place. And Congress began debating impeachment. And Johnson added fuel to the fire when he began organizing a separate army department called the Army of the Atlantic, with headquarters in Washington. And he placed good old William Tecumseh Sherman, the man who is still hated in the South to this day for his scorched earth tactics, in charge of that military department in February 1868. So the new Congress and the new president have competing military headquarters. So this is clearly a very dangerous situation. And if you want to signal anything to Congress, it's a pretty clear message when you put William Sherman in charge. And in doing so, Johnson was said to have remarked, quote, "That would set some of them thinking," them being the Republicans. Now this terrified a lot of people, including Sherman himself, and that must have taken a lot. And one historian describes Sherman as being flummoxed by the appointment, and Sherman ended up refusing it. And he was quoted as saying, quote, "The president would make use of me to beget violence. He has no right to use us for such purposes, though he is commander-in-chief." Now here you have about as volatile a situation as any American history. You have a Congress at war with the president, attempting to emasculate his authority, and improperly, as many considered it, usurp his constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. You have a president who is willing to use pretty aggressive means to counter this, maybe even create his own chain of command through a new military body personally loyal to himself. People are hearing rumors of war, that a civil war might reignite again, that Johnson himself is plotting an attack on Congress. And since all of this, a constitutional, a social, a military crisis is happening, as I've said before, just a couple of years after the worst war in the country's history, another civil war probably wouldn't have seemed that far-fetched. Carl Schurz, a Missouri senator at the time, later recalled, quote, "The air throughout the country was buzzing with rumors of iniquities which Johnson was meditating and would surely attempt if he was not disarmed. There was a widespread feeling among well-meaning and sober people that the country was really in some sort of peril." Now, in firing Stanton, Johnson was basically daring Congress to impeach him. And so, on February 24th, 1868, the U.S. House of Representatives did something it never did before in our history. It voted to impeach the President of the United States. The vote in favor of impeachment was an overwhelming 128 to 47. The House specifically passed 11 articles of impeachment against Johnson, mostly related to his violating the Tenure of Office Act and his attempt to restore his authority over the Army in the South. Now, just as a quick primer, impeachment itself is not removal from office. To impeach someone is just another way of saying to try someone in a court of law, but the defendant is a federal government official, and a guilty vote results in removal. When a majority of the House passes articles of impeachment, they are basically charging a government official with a crime. There is a jury. In this case, it is the U.S. Senate, where 2/3 of a guilty vote in the Senate results in a conviction, and therefore removal from office. The Supreme Court Chief Justice presides over the trial. So basically, in an impeachment, the federal government becomes a giant courtroom. According to Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office for bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. As the first presidential impeachment in American history, this would inevitably serve as a test case for defining what met that standard of high crimes and misdemeanors. So Andrew Johnson's trial began March 5th, 1868. Johnson's old foe, Thaddeus Stevens, the guy he publicly said he wanted to hang, along with a couple of other congressmen, were his prosecutors. And it appeared that they believed they had a real chance to remove Johnson. And I guess this is understandable since they had enough support to successfully override his veto several times. But questions remained. Republicans believed Johnson had made bad policy decisions, but did that necessarily constitute high crimes and misdemeanors? And yes, Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act, but was that law even constitutional? Didn't it seem a bit of an unconstitutional encroachment on the president's powers? So from the beginning, convictions seemed to rest on shaky ground. And there was another reason in Johnson's favor, a political reason. You see, if Johnson was removed, the president pro tem of the Senate would succeed him as president. This was because there was no vice president at the time. The office was vacant. And the next person in line of succession was the pro tem, and that person was Benjamin Wade, a Republican senator from Ohio. And Wade was known as an extreme radical, very liberal for his time, even for his own party. And if Wade became president, he would be a Republican incumbent president during the 1868 election. And that was supposed to be the year that the Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant, the victorious Civil War general, and they were going to ride his coattails to victory. And many Republicans didn't want to do anything that would jeopardize Grant's chances. So political considerations had dictated Johnson's rise to the presidency, and now they would dictate whether he would remain there. Now, Johnson's advisors insisted that he not appear during the trial or make any public comment. And I would have to say that that is a wise move, considering Johnson's history as a loose cannon. And Johnson had to have been aware that his historical reputation was in jeopardy. He might be the first American president to suffer the indignity of being removed from office. So Johnson began to do something that thus far hadn't characterized him before, something that, had he done earlier, he might have had a very different presidency. He began to make compromises. Behind the scenes, Johnson let it be known that he would be willing to acquiesce to much of the Republicans' Reconstruction program and to appoint people that the Republicans could accept. Well, they say that necessity is the mother of invention, so here we see the invention of a new Andrew Johnson, a kinder, gentler Andrew Johnson. Earlier, I mentioned that Johnson was the subject of a movie. The movie is titled Tennessee Johnson. It came out in 1942 during World War II, many years after Johnson died. And this movie is quite sympathetic to Johnson. It portrays the radical Republicans as the villains and Johnson as a political martyr seeking to unify the country. Imagine a movie like that coming out now, where the people in favor of African American suffrage were considered the bad guys. It's unthinkable now, but not in 1942. Anyways, at the end of the movie, Johnson appears during his impeachment trial and gives a heartfelt speech that moves the Senate, pure Hollywood, and allows him to barely survive removal from office. Well, none of that actually happened. At least most of it didn't happen. It's a great story, but it's fiction. The actual result might seem a bit anticlimactic in comparison. Johnson complied with his aide's advice to stay silent. Maybe he figured his mouth had gotten him into enough trouble. The questionable constitutionality of the Tenure of Office Act, as well as Johnson's assurances to Republicans, cast enough doubt on whether he had committed high crimes and misdemeanors. Ultimately, this was sufficient to prevent the two-thirds majority of the senators that were needed for a conviction. The radical Republicans needed 36 out of 54 senators to convict, and they were able to muster 35. So Andrew Johnson was acquitted by just one vote. In fact, several Republicans actually voted not guilty, so by the end of May, the impeachment was in effect over. Now, although Johnson was spared removal, he was a lame duck for the remainder of his presidency and forever tarred as the first American president to be impeached. In the middle of his trial, the Republicans indeed nominated General Grant as their presidential candidate, whose slogan was, "Let us have peace," something the country desperately needed. That July, Democrats held their own convention, and Johnson sought renomination from his old party. But his candidacy failed to get any traction, and they instead nominated the former governor of New York, Horatio Seymour. Horatio, another great name. Rufus, Hannibal, Horatio. Anyways, that fall, the Republicans won a relatively close race. They got the presidency back. General Grant became president. Johnson left office on March 4th, 1869, refusing to attend his successor's inauguration. Now, when I think about Andrew Johnson, I'm really struck by how multifaceted his story is. Most of the presidents that we consider failures are a bit easier to characterize. They were usually well-meaning but ineffective, like Pierce, Buchanan, Hoover. They often lacked political courage and allowed events to unfold for the worse without doing much to stop them. If anything, their greatest sins were sins of omission. But Andrew Johnson was of a different breed. Unlike most of those other presidents, he actually had a lot of courage, almost foolhardiness. Whatever you can say about him, taking a stand as a pro-unionist when you were a Southern senator took a great deal of courage, even when your life was threatened. For decades, Johnson was celebrated by many Americans. Case in point, Hollywood made a movie about him romanticizing his life in the 1940s. Even by then, many Americans admired him as the man who tried to reconcile North and South and to protect the constitutional powers of the presidency. But since then, the failure of Reconstruction has become more clear. And as America continues to deal with centuries-old divisions, Johnson's contributions to those failures became more evident. Now, Winston Churchill once described a contemporary by saying he has all the virtues I dislike and none of the vices I admire. I've always felt that this quote could apply to Andrew Johnson. He was a man whose virtues magnified his vices. He had great courage, but it was often for causes on the wrong side of history. He had great determination to overcome immense obstacles, but it left him embittered and resentful. Indeed, he was a man rife with contradictions. I mean, what can we say about a man who rose from rags to riches, who had no education, and yet rose to become the only man in American history to serve as a mayor and a congressman, senator, governor, vice president, president? A man who had as much experience as any man in American politics, and yet was so politically inept. What are we to say about a man who was friends with Abraham Lincoln, and yet, by permitting the rise of black codes and Jim Crow, did more to destroy his legacy than anyone else? It was a historical accident that allowed Andrew Johnson to become president. As I've said, he may have been disliked by many and out of step with much of the country, but he rose to the presidency because of unusual circumstances, because his presence rounded out the Union ticket in 1864, and because of the assassination of President Lincoln. Political strategy and the actions of one John Wilkes Booth placed him in charge of the nation in 1865. And think of the consequences of those decisions, consequences that no one realized then. At a time when the country was divided more than ever before, at a time when statesmanship was desperately needed, when 4 million African Americans faced an uncertain future, when the country faced a critical pivot point in the relationship between its black and white citizens. History, circumstance, politics, chance moments, all of these things conspired to put one of the most divisive, politically inept, and bigoted men in the office of the presidency. Andrew Johnson's rise to that office may have been an accident, but it remains one of the greatest and most consequential tragedies in American history. Johnson retired home to Tennessee and was celebrated a hero. Seeking vindication, he sought election to the Senate and was finally elected in 1875, becoming the only U.S. president to ever serve in the Senate after the White House. Less than 5 months later, he suffered a stroke, and on July 31st, 1875, died at the age of 66. If you want to learn more about today's episode, check out the book Impeached, The Trial of President Andrew Johnson and the Fight for Lincoln's Legacy by David Stewart. Although these first 2 episodes were solo performances, in future episodes we will feature special guests in interviews or group discussions. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal with creative consulting from Emily O'Connor. Special thanks to my dad, Bert Chu, who created our website. Find us on the web at thisamericanpresident.com for show notes about this and all future episodes. Follow us on Twitter at thisamerpres for updates. Also, please review us on iTunes to help us promote the podcast. Now I'm going to leave you with a clip from the trailer of the 1942 film Tennessee Johnson. I actually tried to find the movie, and I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find it. The trailer is the only thing I could find on YouTube. I'm Richard Lim, and we're back next week with more of This American President.
I miss my wife and my family. I dream at night of green grass and trees.
Who was the orphan boy who was apprenticed to a tailor and could neither read nor write until he met the girl who was to become his wife and a first lady of the land? What's his name? He was the 17th president to take the oath of office, succeeding the great emancipator as chief executive. Named for another great president, Old Hickory Jackson. He was affectionately known as Old Andy. What's his name? He was the only president the Congress ever impeached. and he fought gallantly to save his name and office. His name was Tennessee Johnson.
Senators, the issue before you and before the whole country is not my fate as an individual. It is the issue of union or disunion.
From the sturdy fibers of Andrew Johnson's stormy life, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer has fashioned a brave drama of a proud young America, valiantly fighting for unity, unity, unity.